welcome to the Astranti Financial Training Pre-Scene Analysis for the February 2017 Operational Case Study. And in this pre-scene, we've been given the wonderful company Mavis Venderby to take a look at. You can just see her head popping up at the bottom of the screen there. Lovely. Before we get well acquainted with Mavis and her business, I'll just say a few quick words about myself so you know who you're dealing with. So my name is James and I'm a co-director here at Astranti. Been with Astranti for several years now, and at one time or another I've been involved with pretty much every single aspect of production within the business, including the case study exam, so you're in safe hands with me. Just to go through a few more things, I'm a mock writer, so the case studies when they started for CIMA back in 2015, we've been doing specialised case study products ever since. One of those are mock exams, and I've written several of the mocks that we've released over the years. And I'm also consider myself something of a case study expert. Like I say, the case study exam started back in 2015, and ever since then I've been involved in one way or another with pretty much every pre-scene and case study. That's at operational management or strategic level. Been involved in pretty much everyone in one way or another since its inception. So I know a lot about how the case study works, how the pre-scene works, and how the pre-scene sets itself up for the exam later on. In addition to that, I've also actually written a real case study exam for CIMA back in 2015. We wrote a CIMA Asia exam that was actually used in a real exam over in the CIMA Asia region. And so not only have I been looking and experienced with case studies for a few years, but I've actually written one as well. So I've wrote the pre-scene, and I know what it's involved and how the pre-scene is a really good guide to the kind of things that's going to come up in the exam. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, I'm one of the main study text authors here at Astranti, and I've been involved again with pretty much every study text that has come out, and that includes all levels and all pillars. So my actual area of expertise are the finance pillar, so the F1 and F2 study texts, but I've worked on the enterprise pillar and the P pillar as well, so there's not really much that I haven't looked at in my time here. I've got a good general all-round knowledge, which is perfect for the case study exams. So what can you expect from this video series? What are we going to do? Why is it worth anything to you? Why is it worth your time? So the first thing we're going to do is we're really going to take the pre-scene that's been given, and we're just going to go through it with a fine-tooth comb, looking at every little detail as we go through, because as I said, getting to know the pre-scene and having a good understanding of the pre-scene is really the best way to be prepared for the exam. So what particularly we're going to focus on are some of the key points. So as we go through, I'll be making key points, areas that as I read through, I think, well, that's definitely going to be an important thing, and that's almost certainly going to be relevant at some stage in the exam. We're going to be having some industry guidance on how it relates. So I've spent the past few weeks going through everything that I could find on the particular industry that we're involved in on this occasion, and I'm going to be bringing that to the pre-scene and making it relevant and applying it to the scenario, so we have a real world feel for how this all fits together and what kind of things the company are going to be dealing with. We're going to be looking at all the key business models, so of course we're going to be thinking about PESTLE, Porter's Forces, all the kind of business models that we can use to assess and analyse the company, their areas of strength, the weaknesses, and how they may go forward in the future, what kind of things you could say in your exam, because often your role is to advise or to give some kind of information, and one of the best ways to do that are using the classic business models. We're going to be picking up likely exam issues, so those first 3 points there, they all kind of feed down into what are likely things to come up in the exam. And like I said, I wrote one of the pre-scenes for an exam a few years ago, and so the best thing to do really when you're approaching the pre-scene is to kind of read between the lines and think, well, CIMA have written this pre-scene, they've made up this company, and it is a real life industry, but it's a made up company, and you've got to think, well, what areas are they setting themselves up for so they can think of exam scenarios when it actually comes to the exam. So if you look at it in that way, think, well, why have they written it like this? Probably because they've got an exam question that they want to ask about that particular area. So as we go through, I'll be picking out areas of the pre-scene that I think are very likely to be coming up in the exam. And as well as that, I'll be giving some exam hints and tips. So at Astranti, we've got a couple of study texts and textbooks on specifically how to pass your case study exams, and I was heavily involved in the writing of those, so I know plenty about the exams and the extra little tidbits and tips and things that can help you to get through the exam beyond just pure knowledge and application. In addition to the pre-scene videos, so there's going to be a number of pre-scene videos just looking at the pre-scene, we're going to have a strategic analysis, and that won't necessarily involve looking at the pre-scene in too much more depth. We'll already have covered that. This is kind of a big picture, broader look at the company, where they stand and what they can do going forward. And we'll have a specific video dedicated to the top 10 issues. So I'm going to give you 10 things that I think are very likely to come up in the exam in February based on the things that we'll see in the pre-scene. And there's usually a pretty good track record here at Astranti. We're quite proud of the fact that our top 10 issues, more often than not, most of them are things that actually come up in the exam. So that's what you can expect, and here's how it will work. So in the section by section pre-scene videos, I'm going to assume that you haven't seen the pre-scene yet. And you can assume that I haven't really seen it either, because I've been through it a little bit, I've made some notes, but a lot of it we'll be doing as we go through. So you can assume that I'm not going to take any knowledge for granted here. And so what you can do is, before you watch my video and see what I say about it, have a go at reading through it yourself, make some notes, and see how much you can come up with on your own, see how well you do there. And when you've made your own notes, come back to the video and have a look at what I've said, and then maybe see if there's anything that you've missed out or not covered in enough depth, or perhaps there might even be things that you think are good points that I haven't covered myself. And you're welcome to leave a comment and perhaps add anything that you think we've missed out. You're perfectly welcome to do that. And at the end, we'll go through the strategic analysis video and the top 10 issues video. So in total, you're looking at, depending on the length of the pre-scene, sort of 8 or 9 videos in total. So just a few quick notes on the actual pre-scene and your approach to the pre-scene actually that I want to make before we start looking at the thing itself. Context is key here, so the whole idea of the pre-scene is to set up this realistic scenario, this realistic world in which this business operates. And so it's important to always think about the context when we're looking at the issues. Don't write a thing based on the pre-scene before the exam. So do go through the pre-scene in a lot of depth and get as much out of it as you can, but don't assume that you can sort of write your answers to questions before you go into the actual exam, because, as you know, we don't know what's going to be in the exam, and you might waste your time focusing on this one particular issue, and that's one of the issues that doesn't come up in the exam. So don't try to write anything based on the pre-scene. Just use it as a way to learn as much as you can about the business so you can be well prepared in the exam. And the real function of the pre-scene, as we said, it's the background. You're really, if you imagine that you are in a real business for a moment, just suspend disbelief and imagine that you have the actual job of finance officer or whatever it is at this business, and that you're going to be asked to advise or analyze or evaluate certain areas of the business to your boss. So the best way that you would ever be able to do that is to know as much as possible as you can about the business you're working in and the industry they're working in. So that's all this is. The pre-scene is kind of this report that gives you the key information, as much of it as possible, so you can give good answers in the exam. So that's the best approach that I can advise that you take when watching these videos and getting ready for the exam. Okay, so back to the actual pre-scene. Let's get started on this then. So Mavis Venderby is the name of the company, and we can see here from the picture that we've got a lady in a bee suit, a beehive, and she's holding up a honeycomb with some honey in it, presumably. So first impressions from this, it's either going to be beekeeping business or something related to the beekeeping world. And as we scroll down to the very first section, the introduction, we find that Mavis Venderby is a business that manufactures and retails wooden beehives. Okay, so actually that's even a little bit more obscure than we might have expected. Mavis Venderby aren't beekeepers, they don't produce honey or beeswax, they actually produce beehives, so they're a supplier to the beekeeping industry rather than a competitor within it. And what they do is both manufacture and retail them. So let's just highlight these words here. They've got a manufacturer and retailer of wooden beehives. So immediately then we have two clear dimensions within the same business. They're a producer, they make things from raw materials, and they also have a retail aspect as well. And you're going to have to think about logistics and delivery and how they're getting their product to their customers. So let's start by thinking what areas of our studies that we've covered over the past year or so, or however long it is for you. What areas are coming to mind immediately? Well, for me, as a manufacturer, we're going to be thinking all about costing and budgeting. And those are, of course, from our P1 studies. So let's just think about costing. One thing to bear in mind as we go through then, what kind of costing methods are Mavis Venderby using? And are they using the right one for their business? It might be that they're using activity-based costing or ABC costing or whatever it is. But that's not really working for them. Perhaps they should be using a different one. Similarly, we can think about budgeting as well. So what budgeting methods are they using, and is that the appropriate method for their business? And with budgeting as well, we need to think about the variance, whether they're budgeted figures, whether there's much variance between the budgets and the actual figures that are coming in, and perhaps a way for them to reconcile that. So immediately we've got a few things already that we can start to sort of keep these in the back of our mind as we're going through. Another thing, as they are manufacturers from P1, that we can be thinking about is bottlenecks in their production process. So is there any area of their production that is slowing the whole thing down and costing them, essentially in the long term, costing them time and money? Are there any things that can be sped up or improved to make the whole production process more efficient? For example, since Mavis Venderby are making wooden beehives, the production and processing of wood is going to be a big part of their production process, and there's a lot of different elements to using wood that can come up. So are they buying in wood sort of in its very basic state as lumber? Does it need drying? Does it need anything done to it before it can be used, or is it coming in straight away and could go straight into production? These are all things that are going to affect the production process, and things that we can certainly say a few words about. Okay, well, how about some of the other topics? How about F1? What can we think about that's relevant here? Well, as a manufacturer, one of the key things that Mavis Venderby are going to have to deal with is inventory management. What is their inventory management approach in this case? What are their lead times? What is the difference? What is the difference in time between an order coming in and it actually being received by the customer on the other end? Is their production process long, or is it quick? And that all leads in to working capital management as well. Their inventory days, the payables days, and the total working capital cycle. Is that good or is it bad? Is there room for improvement? So there's all these areas that we can narrow down our focus within P1 and F1 already and think, well, as a manufacturer, these are going to be the key areas. As we said, as we're going through, we'll be highlighting key areas. These are some of the key areas that we need to keep our eyes out and be prepared for as we go through. Okay, well, that's just the manufacturing perspective, but what about as a retailer? There's a whole host of other things that we can think of that are relevant there from what we've looked at in E1. For one, what is their marketing strategy? So when thinking about the marketing mix and the 4 Ps of marketing, where do they stand? What kind of strategy are they taking to differentiate themselves from their competitors? What kind of competition is there in the beehive making business? Are there a lot of other competitors within the same industry in the same country, or is there a relatively small number of competitors? how do Mavis Venderby market themselves? Also, when we're thinking about retailing, we're going to think about their pricing strategy, and that sort of closely relates to marketing, but it's also a thing of its own. How are they pricing their beehives? Are they sort of high quality luxury provider, or perhaps they're mid-range, or they're maybe a low cost budget provider of beehives? We don't know yet. We don't know too much about the industry, but again, we're just setting up here. We're just trying to hone in on particular areas that are definitely going to be important for us. Also, if we're applying business models here as well, when we're thinking about Porter's 5 forces, it's both a manufacturer and a retailer, we're going to be thinking about their buyer power, Mavis Venderby's buyer power, and also perhaps their supplier power as well, because they're a supplier to the beehive industry, the beekeeping industry, but they're also obviously a customer for wood, and so they'll be a customer in the lumber industry. Okay, so let's move on to the next bit now and have a look at the history of a company. So we can see that Mavis Venderby was started 70 years ago by Mavis Venderby, who's presumably, or obviously the company is named after, and her husband Benjamin. So it's a family company. They're obviously well established, having been around for 70 years. So that begs the question, again, relating to their marketing strategy, do they have a brand for themselves? Are they the kind of family, sort of home family company that the beekeepers will go to as the sort of safe bet, who've been around for a long time? They kind of look after you. If not, maybe that's something they could incorporate into their branding and their marketing. An interesting question perhaps here is whether or not 70 years is a long time in the beehive industry. I mean, beekeeping is as an activity, as a hobby. Beekeeping has been around for thousands of years, actually going back many years, to as far back as the Egyptians. But commercial beekeeping, and thus the need for a kind of beehive manufacturer, has perhaps only been around for the last 100, 150 years. And so 70 years is a pretty good chunk of that, and so Mavis Venderby, we can assume, are well established in their home country, which in this case is a country called Tuckland, and they have the $T as its currency. It's also situated in the northern hemisphere and has a temperate climate. So we're thinking it's probably something like a European country in Western Europe, something like the UK or the Netherlands or Belgium. It doesn't matter too much if there's a specific comparison there. It's just a general idea for where it's based. And that can help us when it comes to something like a pestle analysis, because if we can sort of draw some comparisons between Tuckland and a kind of EU-style country, then we can immediately assume some things about its currency and whether it is exposed to any exchange risk or a currency risk, or thinking about the other aspects of pestle as well, thinking about any other economic impacts, such as inflation or changing interest rates. These are all things that are going to impact Tuckland, and you never know what's going to come up in the exam. We could have something based around that. As a real life example, just this last year, 2016, the UK decided to leave the European Union, and that's had a very strong impact. Whether it's negative or positive is yet to be seen, really. It's not been long enough, but there's certainly been a rough couple of months since the Brexit vote, where all sorts of things have happened to the UK currency and its ability to trade with the EU, of course. As the value of the pound goes down against the euro, that pushes the cost of imports up, and the cost of living becomes higher in the UK, and such a thing as that. You never know. They might have a scenario in the exam where something like this happens. Also, if we're thinking about pestle, we can think about environment as well here. So Tuckland has a temperate climate. That's of course important because beekeeping tends to be done in temperate climates, and certainly far more than it is done in tropical climates. You'll find that the most beekeeping is done in north of the hemisphere around the globe. So Europe and Asia, Northern Asia, China and North America. These are the main places that beekeeping is done, and so that means that Tuckland is obviously in the right place for as a supplier to the beekeeping industry. And there's also a good chance that they'll have a good supply to them of wood. Obviously, as beehive maker, wood is going to be their major raw material, and so in a temperate climate there's a pretty good chance that that's easy to come across, and so it shouldn't be too high of a cost for them to get good quality wood. Okay, well, just before we move on to the next paragraph then, let's have a think about some real life examples or counterparts to Mavis Venderby, and knowing what we do about Tuckland and roughly where it's based and how long it's been around, we can come up with a few companies based in the UK that are also manufacturers and or retailers of wooden beehives. So the most prominent beehive manufacturer and seller in the UK is Thorn Beehives, and they've been around for quite a long time themselves in the UK and are generally come at the top. They have the biggest market share of beehive sales in the UK, so they're kind of the top dog in terms of the UK at least. And this is a pretty good comparison for Mavis Venderby, because Mavis Venderby, as a well-established beehive manufacturer, they're likely to have a pretty good share of the market in their home country, and so Thorn Beehives are probably fairly similar to Mavis Venderby in real life. There's also a couple more. We have Maysmore and Paynes, who are, relatively speaking, probably second and third in terms of market share, and they're both either manufacturers or retailers. An important thing or an interesting thing to note about real life manufacturers is that often they will be a manufacturer and retailer themselves, but sometimes they will just do the manufacturing and they will sell to a retailer, or you have a few beekeeping or beehive sellers who import their beehives from manufacturers and sell them on, and so it's not always both. In this case, Mavis Venderby are both, and that perhaps is a trick that CIMA have used to make sure there's plenty to discuss when it comes to the actual exam. But in real life, there's a real mixed bag of how these companies tend to be. But one thing that is interesting is they do tend to be family businesses that have been around and they've stuck in the family for many generations, and they continue to be run now by the children or the grandchildren or the great grandchildren of the people who established the company many years ago. Okay, so let's actually move on now to who owns and runs the company in the second paragraph here. So Mavis Venderby is owned by Thomas Venderby and Jacinta Corey, who are the great grandchildren of Mavis and Benjamin. So again, this has been kept within the family, which, as we know now, is a fairly common thing within beehive manufacturers, as it's a fairly small industry. It's kind of obscure, and it tends to be a kind of pursuit of love that turns into a business over time. So the interesting thing about that is that it's owned equally by Thomas and Jacinta. That means that Mavis Venderby are a private company, so they don't sell their shares to the public. That's definitely going to be something that is worth talking about when it comes to thinking about how Mavis Venderby are going to raise funds and raise finance for the various things that they want to do as a business, as a private firm. They have the option, obviously, to start releasing shares to the public, but as it stands, they currently only have a ownership, 50-50 ownership between Thomas and Jacinta. Now, obviously, from a governance perspective, this is an interesting arrangement for a company, because you have Thomas here, who is the managing director, and you have Jacinta, who is the sales and marketing director. Now, these, as the two sole shareholders, the only people that own the company between them, they also hold positions of importance within the company. But between the two of them, although they are on the same level as owners, presumably they have a 50-50 stake in the company, Thomas is actually the managing director, and so from an organizational structure perspective, Thomas is superior to Jacinta. Jacinta will be reporting to Thomas, if you imagine the hierarchy as the managing director. He's kind of at the top of the pyramid, and then one level below him, he has his executives, and as sales and marketing director, Jacinta will be reporting to Thomas. And that begs a kind of interesting question about the relationship between Thomas and Jacinta, who are obviously either cousins or siblings or whatever it is. There may be a kind of tension between them there if they were to disagree over any strategic direction for the business. Then there is potential there for any conflict between the two of them, as on one hand they have an equal stake, an equal share in the company, and so their voices should be equally heard. But then on the other hand, Thomas has slightly more seniority within the company than Jacinta. Also, as we can see that the company has obviously stayed within the family, we don't know too much about the actual experience and skills of Thomas or Jacinta as an owner and the managing director, but presumably as someone who has inherited the business from his family, from his parents or grandparents. We're not too sure about how much Thomas or any of the top level staff or directors at the company really know about some of the key issues in E1. So things about organizational structure and governance, and the shape of the company and how they manage their HR function, for example. We don't know whether someone has been specifically hired to do that or whether there's many more family members involved. So this is a very, very interesting thing to pick up on, because as a family business, there's probably a lot of things that are done in a kind of traditional family way that aren't really thought of as in a more corporate, strategic way, as you may if you were a private sort of enterprise that had no family ties at all. So let's move on to the next paragraph again. So Mavis Venderby produced two types of beehive, and they are the box hive and the slatted hive. So that's a fairly simple portfolio or range of products that they have there. They're just the two kinds of hives. And each type of hive has the same component parts and functionality, but has a different shape. So if, again, we think back to the production methods here, we know that as each type of hive has the same component parts, that's a fairly simple, straightforward process of making sure that all the same parts are ordered. So it's not a case of specialized parts or components needed for specific products. It's all the same stuff, and it can be used to whichever hive needs making the most of. And so thinking about inventory and production methods, that obviously makes it quite an efficient and simple process. Each type of hive is manufactured in two types of wood, cedar and pine. So a very important point here. We knew earlier that one of the main supplies to Mavis Venderby was going to be wood, and here we have the fact that they exclusively use cedar or pine. And once we combine that with the fact that they make two kinds of hive, we know that really all they're doing is four main products. Those four products being the cedar box hive, cedar slatted hive, and then the pine box hive and the pine slatted hive. So a fairly small range of products that should make it a fairly easy operation for them. And as we said before, since we're all using the same component parts, that reduces the scope for complexity in the production process. So we know that probably from this, production is probably fairly efficient and good, but that doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement, and there's probably some area in which we're going to be focused on is going to be a key issue, because certainly as sort of users of raw material, cedar and pine, it's definitely going to be something there in terms of the price of wood being affected by various natural events or phenomenon, or how the market and industry is working. That's obviously going to have an impact on the costs of Mavis Venderby and their production. We also want to be thinking about the quality of the wood. Are they getting quality wood? What is the relative quality of cedar compared to pine? Is one inferior or superior than the other? Is one more popular among among customers? Are there other kinds of wood that they could be using that get a better They're better, more efficient woods that perhaps last longer or are more durable, or perhaps on the other side are cheaper woods that allow them to make cheaper beehives and enter the market in that way as a more budget beehive producer, perhaps for new hobbyist beekeepers, people who are new to the beekeeping industry. One more important thing to get from this paragraph as well then is that all hives are sold flat packed. That's very important because this tells us a lot about their approach to retailing. They're taking the flat pack approach, which obviously means they're removing the assembly stage from their production process. So the customer assemble them at home. It's kind of the IKEA model of you have all this, having all the furniture and you have the big store and people go in and look at it, and then they can take it home with them there and then in a nice sort of cardboard box that they can probably fit in their car, rather than having to get this expensive special delivery ordered for large chunks of furniture. And in a similar way, obviously a beehive is a fairly large, awkward object, and you can't necessarily just fit it in the back of your car. And so to be able to have a flat-backed version of a beehive that you could perhaps take home with you that very same day, that's obviously something that customers, particularly probably new customers and people who are looking to get into beekeeping, are going to be very appreciative of that kind of thing. That's what it means from a customer perspective. It also simplifies things from the company's perspective as well in terms of logistics and delivery. So presumably what they would do is, if there's a shop, they would have a certain number of their flat pack hives built up in the showroom to show people, but they'd have large numbers of hives sort of already packed up in their cardboard boxes or however it is they store them, sort of ready to go as soon as they're ordered. It makes it fairly simple, although not completely simple, and there are issues as well with using flat pack furniture. So for example, if you're a customer and you're brand new to beekeeping and you're not too sure about it and you want to buy a beehive and you pick up this flat pack beehive, you get it home, you can't really follow the instructions, you're not too sure what you're supposed to do, then you're going to be very frustrated and you'd have wished you just have been able to order one fully made and you could just get straight on with it. So there obviously there's drawbacks to that as well, but flat pack furniture is a phenomenon. It's a part of retailing and delivery. It's fairly well established now. Lots of firms and lots of businesses across many industries do it, and so there's going to be a fair amount that we can say regarding that. Okay, so next paragraph then, let's just scroll down for this. As well as wooden hives, Mavis Venderby also sells foundation and frames. Now let's find out what foundation and frames are. No doubt a very important aspect of the beehive. So foundation is the base on which bees will form a comb into which the honey will be placed. So the foundation then, this is the thing that the bees build their hive onto. So if we go back to the diagram that was on the first page, the frame is just the bit in the middle with the honeycomb in it. The foundation is the bit in the middle with the honeycomb in it, and the wooden bit around the outside, that's the frame. So we know that Mavis Venderby make both the foundation in the middle and the wooden frame, and these are both kind of vital components of the actual beehive, where presumably the enclosure bit here really just holds the bees in it, and what the bees really need is the foundation and the frame. And this brings up other questions as well. So foundation is the base on which bees will form a comb into which honey will be placed. Now we don't know yet what that is made of, but presumably there's some kind of wire system there where there's a kind of perhaps a basic honeycomb already built into it. There needs to be some kind of support in the foundation, and so there's likely to be something other than wood being used there. So we need to think about other supplies that Mavis Venderby are having to buy in. But the frame is made of wood, which the beehive is already made out of wood, and so we still wouldn't be too difficult to do that. And the frame is obviously the wooden support around the foundation. Each of the Mavis Venderby's hives will hold up to 20 framed foundations. Now that's an interesting term to learn. I'm not sure if many of you know how a beehive works, but each bee, if you think of a beehive as that big sort of wooden enclosure for the bees, inside each of those there isn't just one honeycomb, there are actually up to 20 according to this, and so the bee colony will live inside the hive and produce up to 20 foundations of honeycomb. And interestingly, frames used to be made, so frames were at one stage made by Mavis Venderby. We're not sure why they stopped, perhaps it was an issue of cost, but they're now bought in and sold, so it's more cost effective for them to buy in and sell them on. So that's something that they've decided to do, is rather than manufacturing and retailing the frames in this instance, they just buy them in because it's more cost effective. Now that also, if they were willing to do that, then we may be thinking that something that might come up in the exam, a possible issue, is going to be what else can they import or buy in instead of making in-house that's going to be more cost effective. So it may be that, based on some unseen information in the exam, it's much cheaper to buy in the foundations than it is to produce them in-house, and so they should start buying and retailing foundations rather than building them. And it may also be that certain kinds of beehives, we don't know yet how many kinds of beehives there can be. There's obviously different styles of beehives you can have. There may be certain areas that Mavis Venderby aren't producing certain beehives yet, and it might be possible for them to test out a new line of products by first buying them in rather than producing them in-house. Obviously, it's not just as simple as buying in wood and then turning them into beehives. There's obviously other elements as well being added here. So the foundation, the need for metal, and the fact here that it says foundation and frames are sold and packaged separately from the wooden beehives. So obviously, if you already own a beehive or a couple of beehives and you wanted to buy foundation and frame separately, that's obviously a good thing to do that. But if you're a first-time customer, you might want to buy a kind of all-in-one starter package, and so there's scope there for perhaps a new product or something like that. We don't know yet exactly what it is that they offer. Okay, so moving on to the next paragraph again, Mavis Venderby sells all of its products directly to the public, so they're directly involved in marketing and retailing to the public. They don't work through any other medium in between. And that brings us back to the idea of the marketing approach and marketing strategy that we discussed earlier on about bringing that knowledge from our E1. As someone who deals directly with the product, directly with the public, then Mavis Venderby are going to need some kind of sales team who are trained in dealing with the public. And that's obviously, if we just read on as well, we probably find out it has its own store. So they actually have a physical store where they sell beehives, and that's located at the factory site. But the majority of sales here are actually made through the website or over the telephone. So, okay, we know immediately from the mention that a website that there's going to be some IT information system issues here, whether their website is an important contributor to their overall sales or whether they haven't got a very well developed website, we don't know yet, but obviously that's something that's very likely to be worth talking about. Also, as they're making sales over the telephone, that kind of suggests that there's some kind of catalogue or something that people have access to, and you have to ask the question, well, how much does that cost to produce as their catalogue? Do they make significant sales over the phone to warrant production of a catalogue or keeping people trained on telephones for sales and things like that? What size is their sales team? And what kind of setup do they have in their own store? So is it a large store? Do they have lots of their beehives sort of produced and set up and they have people coming in? Obviously, it's nice to have their store, but it says here that the majority of sales are actually made through the website and telephone. So is there perhaps an argument to be made that having the store isn't, if it doesn't turn over a certain amount of profit, or if it isn't profitable compared to other divisions, then perhaps the store shouldn't really be there at all. The business has 4 directors, Thomas and Jacinta, who we've already talked about. We also have Joseph Perez as the production designer and Penny Lopez as the finance director. So those are the 4 main directors that we're going to be dealing with the company, and that kind of suggests that it's actually a fairly small operation with presumably Thomas. If we think of, again, the organisational structure, Thomas at the top, and then his sort of 3 directors immediately below him, and then the director, the head of each individual department within that company. It employs a range of skilled and unskilled people. So bringing that beat back to E1 and the HR issue, and whether there is a good support network within the company. What is the HR system like? Obviously, we mentioned before that as it's a family business, it may be quite kind to its workers. As it's a small operation, it may be fairly informal. But on the other hand, since it is a family business and perhaps it is expanding and it is growing, do they have adequate systems in place to make sure that staff are treated fairly and kept safe as the company grows? And like we said, the organisational structure is fairly small, and it's a functional structure with each director overseeing a particular function of the business. And let's move on to the final paragraph here. So they've recently moved from a small unit to new premises. Now that's an interesting fact to learn from. Now they've recently moved from a small industrial unit to new premises. Now we're not sure why they've done that, but that's going to be an important factor to think about, because that means presumably that they have had to increase their financing and expenditure in this past financial year to afford the new premises. Now we don't know the circumstances under which they've moved to the new premises, whether they've raised, whether they've had to go to the bank to get a loan, or whether they've used it out of their own money. Most likely they're going to have had to raise some money for these new premises. We need to know what happened to the old industrial unit. And if they are buying a new premise, presumably they're doing so because they've got a sort of strategic plan for the long term in which they're hoping to expand and perhaps go into other areas. So we know they make beehives, but essentially that is a job of carpentry and dealing with enclosures. So there's no reason why they perhaps couldn't, diversify into other areas, perhaps staying within animals, the world of animals. But again, that's certainly, it's a kind of a big giveaway. I remember when I said earlier about when you're reading through the pre-scene, try and read between the lines and think about how CIMA are trying to set themselves up so that they can ask questions about this pre-scene. This is definitely something that we need to keep our eye on, because it's such an obvious kind of clue to something that they're going to want to ask a question on. And actually, just reading on, we learn a bit more about the new premises, that there used to be a farm estate offices, associated barns and outbuildings. So again, until we read on, we don't know, but there's probably an extent to which the managing director here, Thomas, is trying to expand the business and go forward, and he's got kind of some big plans for what they want to do in the future. Maybe again, sort of going beyond just producing beehives and producing other enclosures, perhaps again staying with animals, or maybe not, maybe going somewhere completely different. And here we are at the bottom. There is now plenty of scope for expansion. Wink, wink. It's almost as if the person or CIMA are literally sort of shouting this at you. Now, of course, it could be a red herring. There's also always that possibility that they've put something in here and you think, well, God, that's an obvious one. That should be something we prepare for. But at the same time, they have been known to throw a few things in there that they never examine in the end. But I would say in this situation, it's too nice a thing from their perspective. From when you're writing questions for the case study exam, this is a nice area that you can really sort of have some nice questions in there. So I think there's a pretty good chance that this is going to be one of the issues that comes up in the exam. Okay, so just before we finish this page then, let's just kind of round it up with a bit of context and relating it back to the various papers, so E1, F1, P1, and perhaps thinking about a few business models that we can use. So for one, we could do a very quick kind of SWOT analysis just based on this early information to get ourselves a kind of general idea of what Mavis Venderby, where their strengths and weaknesses are, any opportunities that we may see, or threats as well. So let's just quickly jot down some ideas for a SWOT. And in fact, why don't you have a go at doing that now? Pause the video and then come back and then see what we can come up with together. Okay, so just starting with strengths then, something we could definitely say is that they're well established, knowing that they've been around for 70 years or so. Certainly within Tuckland anyway, they're a well established firm and they probably, as we say, have a fairly large chunk of the pie in terms of market share. And it's also a fairly simple operation as well. They've only got a few products that they make and they're all made from the same components. And they've got this flat pack sort of operation as well, where they even makes the delivery system and how they get the product out to the customers even simpler as well. So those are a couple of strengths for them, but let's consider the weaknesses as well. And the main issue for me here is governance. We don't know too much yet, obviously, but just from reading those first couple of paragraphs about the way it's all set up, we had that issue between Thomas and Jacinta. They're both the only owners, and yet Thomas is kind of the superior to Jacinta. There's also an element of them being related, and it's a family operation, and that's always sort of it can be good, but there's scope for kind of pettiness and a lack of professionalism sometimes. Of course, that can be, they can use that to their advantage in terms of branding, but purely from an organisational governance perspective, I think there might be some issues here in terms of how they've got everything set up, and their experience has something to be desired as well, not in terms of beekeeping industry, but perhaps in running business purely from a kind of business background. We're not too sure about what's going on there. An obvious opportunity in the last paragraph, we found out they've just bought new premises, and so there's obviously scope for expansion there. That's a great opportunity for them to develop the business and perhaps diversify, go into other areas where they're not so dependent on this one industry of beekeeping, which even it may be doing well at the moment, but you don't know where that industry is going to be in 5 years' time. So that's certainly an opportunity for them. And that actually does bring us on to the threats. How reliable is the beekeeping industry? We hear reports all the time of how the number of bees, the population of bees in the world is declining and drastically dropping off, and we may find that in a few years we'll be at dangerously low levels. Does this mean that a company that produces beehives for that industry, can they carry on? Is that something that they'll be able to do throughout the future? And obviously we don't know what the competition is like in Tuckland for Mavis Venderby, so that's an unknown threat at this stage, but it's likely that on the one hand, beekeeping, as numbers of bees go down, it could mean that a decline in the industry, but then on the other hand, as the numbers of bees decline, since it is such a massive thing across the globe, and scientists are always saying, and naturists and everything, they're always saying that we need the bees to keep everything going. They're important for pollination and our crops and our food. So that might actually push more people into beekeeping. And so as it grows as an industry and gets more popular, you may find more and more people entering the beehive making business. And so that's going to be more threats, more competition for Mavis Venderby. Okay, so there's a very rough and ready SWOT analysis. Obviously, we didn't want to go into too much depth because there's not that much to talk about yet without just pure speculation. Obviously, we'll perhaps come back to this more as we go through. But one thing worth noting there is that these things that we've picked up, the things I've picked up on, roughly equate to sort of what we can expect the top issues to be in, particularly the exam issues. So certainly the expansion, I think that's will be something that's going to come up in the exam, advising on how to expand and diversify and what kind of other new products or new areas that the company might go into. Certainly governance, I think, may be a weakness as well. That's likely to be an exam issue. Perhaps something with HR, the fact that we mentioned skilled and unskilled people, but it's also, we don't know what system they have in place for that yet. Okay, so that does it for the first video. All that remains for me to say is thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. And I'll just take a few moments of your time, if I could, to just tell you about some of the other case study materials that we offer. So one of the things is a study text. Now this is a study text specifically aimed at the case study, and we have one for each level. So we have an operational, management and strategic level one, and they're designed to help you pass the study. They're in two halves. The first half is exam tips and exam strategy and advice on how to answer questions and all the really useful kind of tips that you need going into these exams and how to prepare for them. And then the second half, the second part of those, is a recap of the key theory that always comes up in the case studies again and again. So those are really useful, really valuable thing that you can get. Those are available online, and you can get an actual textbook, a printed physical textbook, for the old-fashioned among you who like to do it that way still. We also have course videos that correspond with that study text as well. So we have a series of really nicely well-produced, well-done videos in which we basically take you through exactly what's involved in the case study and how you can spend your time preparing for it to ensure that you get really good marks. It's really, really great series of videos there. We've got the pre-scene analysis, which the video you just watched is an example of the pre-scene analysis, and there'll be several more videos just like that where we look at every tiny detail of the pre-scene and we relate it back to the P1 or F1 or E1, and we relate it to real life scenarios, relate it to actual business and analysis tools, and we give you the what we expect to be the top 10 issues. Another thing that we do slightly different is the industry analysis, and that is this is a really great document in which we basically cover everything that's relevant to the industry for the particular business that we're looking at. And it goes from their history through to the customers and suppliers and the market and how the market has functioned and the history of that. And we've got statistics in there and diagrams, and it's full of information. It's so useful. And at the end of that pack, we also have 25 actual industry examples. So real life things that have happened in that industry, that kind of examples of things that might actually happen to to the company in the exam. So it gives you a sense of the kind of things that are going on in the industry and how real life businesses in that industry have coped with it. We have mock exams, which are, if you were going to pick any one of these to do, I would suggest it was the mock exams, because nothing prepares you for the exam more than actually sitting a mock exam. And if I were a student taking this, I would certainly put mock exams at the top of my list, along with marking and feedback. Now, our mock exams are actually designed to match the way that the actual CIMA exams are, so you can sit them on your laptop and they'll be timed and automatic, and they are as close as you are going to get to the real thing. And you can get marking and feedback on that as well, which is probably the most valuable thing you could probably get. To get specific feedback from a marker who deals with this exam 4 times a year, that's the best way for you to improve your ability to pass this exam as quickly as possible. We also have a masterclass. So as an online company, we hold an online masterclass which you can sign up for, and it's a day over the weekend. We do the Saturday and a Sunday, and it's a full day's worth of we have an expert who takes an online seminar, and we go through everything specific to that case study that you can do to get prepared for the exam. And we cover all sorts, and it's very, very popular among students who like a one-on-one kind of classroom environment in an online situation. We also offer pass guarantee. So if you're unlucky enough to not pass your exam the first time round, then there's no worries, because we give you the option. If you choose a pass guarantee option, then as long as you hit all the minimum requirements that we ask, and you don't pass, then you get access to our materials for the next sitting, completely free of charge. So there's something that we're doing to try and get you. Hopefully, if you signed up to our course and you do everything that we say you should do, then you probably will pass first time. That tends to be the way it goes. But if you should be unfortunate, if it's a particularly tough exam, then we'll let you have another go for free. So that's it. Thanks again for watching. Remember, my name is James. You can find me on Facebook, James Nutting Astranti, where I'll be posting all sorts of information about the upcoming exam in February. Make sure you check that out, because there's always something to talk about with regards to that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.